Welcome to another episode of the Bible Toolbox. I'm Lydia.
And I'm Luke, and we're here to help you enjoy the Bible through the tools that scholars and programmers have created for you. And I guess we kind of have, we have Dr. Peter Gurry here as our guest, who's both a scholar and a programmer.
Bridging the two worlds.
Yeah, so Peter Gurry got his PhD at the University of Cambridge and is now an associate professor of New Testament and co-director of the Text and Canon Institute at Phoenix Seminary. So welcome, Peter.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks, guys. It's great to be here. One minor correction. I cannot honestly put myself in the category of programmers. Programmers do programming and I do web and graphic design.
Okay.
And any good programmer will know those are not the same. So I should not put myself in that company of people. But I do
Right.
graphic design, and that does mean I've worked with lots of programmers over the years.
Thanks for that.
You also, you bridge the world of biblical studies and computer.
Yeah.
Whatever.
More because of the area of my research than because of my own personal skills.
Okay.
I mean, I am comfortable around computers, but again, I'm not like a legit programmer. So, but yes, my research is on computer software that's used to do what I do. So in that regard, yes, you're right. I do bridge the gap.
So what do you do? Tell us about yourself.
What do I do? That's a great question. What do I do? So the main thing I do is I teach. I teach a lot of Greek, and I teach courses in the New Testament here at Phoenix Seminary. And then the other thing I do here at the seminary is I co-direct the Text and Canon Institute, which is an institute my colleague and I started about maybe 3 years ago now. And its mission is pretty broad: to illuminate the history of the Bible. And what we mean by that is help people better understand how we got the Bible. So everything from how it was copied by hand. That's my main expertise, as I work with manuscripts of the Bible. And then, but that also then includes the canon, how we got the books of the Bible. And then lastly, the one that's most, let's say, closest to home for our listeners is Bible translation. So if most of our listeners, I assume, read the Bible in English, you can thank a translator for that. And so at the Text and Canon Institute, we try to study that whole spectrum of how we got the Bible, from copying all the way to translation. And we do that through conferences at churches. We write books and we publish articles at our website. And then we also try to facilitate academic research as well through things like academic conferences and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So what got you interested in studying manuscripts and the history of the Bible and so on?
It really started. So I grew up with the English Bible. When I was a kid, my mom got me a New King James Version. And I still have it, actually, behind me. And I read that. That was my first Bible. And then in high school, I went to a Christian high school and was given the option of taking one of two foreign languages. You had to take one. So it was either Spanish or Greek.
Okay.
And I'm the youngest of 5 children, and I generally did not like doing what everybody else did. So like if my older brothers, bought this kind of car, I was going to buy the other kind of car, that sort of thing. So I was like, everybody takes Spanish. That's boring. I'm going to take Greek. I didn't even know what that meant. 4 years later, I'd taken 4 years of high school, Koine Greek, so New Testament Greek. Had a really good foundation in the grammar. And that sparked a real interest in me in how we got the Bible, because I got my first printed Greek New Testament in that high school class.
Mm-hmm.
And I was the kind of over eager student who was busily correcting my English translation because I thought I knew what the Greek said. That's not a good idea when you're a beginning student, by the way, but it was the spark that lit the fire, you might say, of my interest in this bigger question of how we got the Bible. Because later I got to Bible college and I realized there were handwritten manuscripts, Greek manuscripts, behind my printed Greek New Testament. So it was sort of like one step further back in the process. And so ever since, I've been really fascinated with how do we get what I might call a neat and tidy printed English Bible from what are thousands of Greek copies of the New Testament that have differences between them. So that whole process, though, there's lots of decisions that have to be made between those 2 points.
Mm-hmm.
So that interests me.
So as somebody who studied it more than probably most people, would you say the Bible is reliable and we can trust it?
Yes, that's the simple answer. Yes, it is. You want me to say more? You probably want me to say more.
Talk about the copying process.
Yeah.
Yes.
Crazy.
So the reason why there are, I think, two reasons why people think the copying process is maybe a reason not to trust the Bible. Okay. The first one is there's a common idea that the copying process is like the telephone game. And if you played a telephone game when you're a kid, the first kid in the line says something, and then he whispers it to the next person, and that person whispers it to the next one, on and on. You get to the end, and the last person says out loud what he thinks he heard, and it turns out it's nothing at all like what the first person said.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so people often have that impression of how the Bible was copied because it was copied by hand. Scribes made mistakes, and it just got worse and worse over time. So that here we are, 2,000 years away from the New Testament. What we have now must just be a garbled version of what the apostles and their associates wrote. Okay, let's start there. There are two problems with that simple analogy. The first is that in contrast to the telephone game, the transmission of the New Testament has multiple lines of transmission. Okay, so in a telephone game, there's only ever one line, right? So the first person starts and you tell one person at a time. But the transmission of the New Testament, you can take one copy and make 5 copies from it. Right? And then each of those 5 copies can be copied. And all of a sudden, just from there, you've now got 5 lines of transmission that you can then compare to each other and start to evaluate and say, you know what? This second line is not the best one. This third one is a bit better, especially in these areas, in these ways, right? And so you can start to evaluate them. That's really helpful because you can compare lines of transmission, which in the telephone game, you can never compare it to anything. All you get to do is hear the person in front of you, and that's it. That's the whole point of the game, is you only get to hear it from one person. Okay. The second thing is that in the telephone game, nobody's ever allowed to jump the line. If you're the guy at the end, and you could go back to the second person in the line, you're much more likely to get the message closer to what the first person said than you would otherwise. And in copying, scribes sometimes did have opportunities to make, say, a scribe in the 12th or 13th century, so he's 1,300 years away from Paul. He still had access to a 2nd, 3rd, or 4th century manuscript, and he could sort of jump the line in that way and copy this much earlier manuscript and therefore be much closer. Okay. The other thing, along with that, is scribes also had the opportunity to correct themselves. So we have lots of copies where the scribe has finished his copy, and then he gets to the end and he stops and he goes back and rechecks his work. So I looked at a manuscript once in Italy. I spent an afternoon with it. It's a complete copy of the New Testament, which is very rare, actually. And on almost every page, he had corrections in the margin. And about half or so of these, I deduced, were simple accidental omissions where his eye had skipped from the same letter to the same letter, and he had left out what's in between. It's a very common mistake that we find in manuscripts all the time. And so I always use him as an example and say, this is a kind of a lousy scribe. But he was a decent corrector, right? So the next person who came after him could have seen all his corrections in the manuscript and used those and incorporated them and made actually a pretty good copy from his initially bad copy, precisely because in between he was able to correct it, right? So that and other reasons, those are some of the reasons why it's not helpful to think of the transmission of the New Testament as like the telephone game, and as the text just getting progressively worse and worse over time. In fact, I would argue that we today are probably in a better position to know what the apostles wrote than maybe anybody in history at any time in history, aside from maybe the first few centuries.
And why is that?
Well, because we have so many more manuscripts than they had, and we have very early ones and good ones. So, okay, so maybe I should say anyone in the first 4 centuries. I don't know, maybe I could put it in that way. But definitely, I think we are much better off than, let's take, for example, the Reformers were in the Reformation. Our Bibles today are based on in the New Testament and the Old too, but in the New Testament are based on more manuscripts, better manuscripts, and earlier manuscripts than what the Reformers had access to. So that's really great. So people sometimes think the further we get away from the time of the Bible, the less certain we get about what it said. Actually, in some ways, in most ways, with the New Testament at least, we are in a much better position than they were back then. And I always like to say, I'm a Protestant. I'm a happy Protestant. I think they did some pretty good theology back then, like some real good theology, even with a slightly inferior Greek New Testament than what I have today. It kind of puts me to shame, frankly, because they did a lot better theology with a slightly less good text. I should be doing better theology if I had a better text. Yeah. So, I don't know.
So when you say a slightly better or worse manuscript, do you mean like the content of it changed, or what was changing that?
Meaning that our Greek text is closer to what the apostles wrote. We have more confidence in that it's the same as what they wrote than what the reformers had. Let me think. Sorry, I'm trying to think if I can think of a good example. Well, I'll think of a famous example. In 1 John 5, 7, and 8, John famously says that there are 3 who bear testimony, and then he names them. And the King James Version says there are 3 who bear witness in heaven along with that: the Father, the Word, and the Spirit, and these 3 are one. And that's a famous proof text for the doctrine of the Trinity that the reformers had in their Bibles. They should not have had it in their Bibles, though, because it was based on very few manuscripts. But they didn't have a good way to know that because they didn't have access to enough manuscripts. Today, we have access to more than 500 copies of 1 John in Greek. And we can now say definitively, at least with our evidence today, that extra bit about the 3 heavenly witnesses is not found in all but about a dozen Greek manuscripts, and they're all late, and they probably all come from Latin. In other words, John didn't write that. Okay? Now, does that mean the reformers were wrong to believe the doctrine of the Trinity? No. Because Christians had believed the doctrine of the Trinity for a long, long time before that. And that includes a lot of Christians who never had that verse in their Bible ever. Because most Greek Bibles never had it in there. Up until the Middle Ages. And so how did they figure out the doctrine of the Trinity? Well, the answer is the right way. They read the whole Bible and they put it all together, and they said the only way everything the Bible says can be true about God is if this is true, that he's one God in 3 persons, right? Okay, so the doctrine of the Trinity is a really important doctrine that the reformers, like those who went before them, got right, even though their text at 1 John 5, 7 was not as accurate as ours is. Does that make sense? So that's what I mean by saying they had really good theology, even though in some places the text of their New Testament was inferior to ours today.
Yeah, because we found more manuscripts.
Because we found more manuscripts. Yeah. They're older, they're better, and we now have more confidence that something that was in their Greek New Testament should not have been there. Or in a few cases, the opposite. Something they missed out on, they didn't have in their manuscripts, we now have in ours. Okay, either one, either direction. Yeah.
Okay. Are there any really hard examples of changes from the reformers until now?
Yes, there are. Okay, I'll give you one that I just had to work on. Okay, so I'm writing a commentary on 2 Peter and Jude, which, just to begin with, are not the easiest books in the world. So maybe that's why they gave them to me. I don't know. But in Jude verse 5, okay, if you're reading the King James Version, you'll have a couple differences there than you will if you're reading something like the ESV today. The most significant one, though, by far, is that the King James Version will tell you that the Lord brought a people out of the land of Egypt. Okay? But the ESV will say that Jesus brought a people up out of the land of Egypt.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So what's going on? Well, that reading Jesus, okay, is found in a group of our earliest manuscripts all have Jesus. Okay. And pretty much all of those manuscripts the reformers did not have access to. They hadn't been discovered yet. They were still buried in Egypt somewhere, presumably. Okay. That's a tough decision. In my commentary, I got through the first 4 verses of Jude, pretty okay. And then it took me, about a month went by before I was able to write on Jude 5.
Wow.
Because I got stuck on this variant, trying to figure out what do I think is the original text that Jude actually wrote. Okay. There's still time. I still got a ways to go on my commentary, so maybe I'll change my mind before I publish. But I do think, I'm convinced right now that Jesus is more likely to be the original reading. Okay. Now, in either case, in my opinion, whether it says, by the way, there are some manuscripts that have other readings as well. Some manuscripts say God. One really weird manuscript says God Christ, which is super weird, but it's a weird manuscript, so I don't take it that seriously. Well, whether it's Lord or Jesus, okay, and those are the 2 main options. The option of God actually is the least likely. Either way, it's actually probably Jesus is the one who's doing it, because the verse right before it, Jude he has referred to our Lord Jesus Christ. Who he says these bad people have denied. And so if he uses Lord in the very next verse, he's probably still talking about the same person of the Trinity, I take it. So actually, either way, he's describing Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, as the one who led a people out of Egypt. Now, that's actually in keeping with what other New Testament writers say about Christ's role in the Exodus. So Paul, for example, says that Christ is the rock in the wilderness that Moses struck and water came out of. The rock that followed them. But what's really striking, if Jesus is the original reading, that's his human name. The other New Testament writers say things like Christ did this or that for the people of Israel in the Exodus. Jude says Jesus, and that's his human name. So actually that part I'm still wrestling with exactly. What's the full significance of him using his human earthly name? We do know, though, by the 2nd century, Justin Martyr, who's a 2nd century Christian apologist, he says explicitly that. He says the exact same thing, that Jesus led the people out of Egypt. So we know that at least by the 2nd century, Christians were very comfortable using this language. And part of that's based on a connection they made between Joshua and Jesus. The name Joshua in Greek is actually the exact same as the name Jesus. They've gotten separated in the English language, but in Greek they're the same spelling, same name. And so they made a profound connection between Joshua and Jesus. And even though technically Joshua didn't lead them out of Egypt, Moses did, right? Joshua does lead them into the promised land. And so he has a pretty instrumental role, you might say, in the Exodus as a whole. So Justin Martyr is probably depending partly on that connection between Joshua and Jesus to say that. Whether Jude is already in the 1st century, that's the big question. Does that make sense? So you asked me for a hard one. That's a really hard one. There are others I could give you, but that's the one that comes to mind because I've been working on it.
Okay. Wow.
There are not a ton of these, by the way. That is probably that's actually, some people say that's one of the hardest decisions to make in the whole New Testament.
Jude 5.
Yep, that Jude 5 is. Now, I think they're right because I'm writing a commentary on Jude, and that makes me feel good about myself. That's true. But it's definitely, maybe with one other, it's definitely the hardest in the book of Jude. I can say that for sure.
Okay.
All right, let's switch gears a little bit. Now let's talk about the canon. This was maybe more popular back when the Da Vinci Code was popular. But what books should be in the New Testament, and how did that come about?
How did that happen? Yeah. So, it's surprising people still are really influenced by the Da Vinci Code, even if they've never read it or seen the movie. So when John, my co-director at the Institute, John Mead, when he and I speak in churches on how we got the Bible, which we just did this last weekend, it's still very common for people to think that the books of the Bible were decided at the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century. And there is less than zero evidence. I don't know if you can have less than zero, but there's zero historical evidence that the Council of Nicaea had anything to do with the canon. There's no record of that. So the Council of Nicaea had nothing to do with it. But that seems to go back to the Da Vinci Code, and that sort of has entered the popular imagination. And part of the reason I think why that explanation is so popular is because it's so simple. Like, it gives you one thing you can point to and say, that's how we got the books of the Bible. A group of bishops voted on it. No. Actually, the only time, no bishops voted on the canon until the Middle Ages and then the Council of Trent. And then I always like to point out there's this New Testament thing, this weird thing that liberal scholars came out with. They actually voted on that. So the only time people voted on the books of the Bible is like the Middle Ages and then today. Not in the ancient church at all. There's no votes on the canon in the ancient church. But I think that explanation has it attracts people. It's attractive to them because it's simple. And in reality, actually, the process of picking or recognizing the books of the Bible took quite a while. And it's a bit messier. It would in some ways be really nice if we could point to one council at one time in one place and say, that's when it happened, but you can't. So instead, what happens is you piece together the evidence of what early Christians write when they sometimes write what are called canon lists, that is lists of authoritative books, which they do from time to time. You look at what they cite in their own works as authoritative, okay? And then I feel like there's a third one that I was thinking of, but those are the only two that come to mind. Oh, and then you see what's in our manuscripts. You can look at that as well, okay? Based on that evidence, it's pretty clear that if I can call it, the bulk of the New Testament is in place by the 2nd and then in the 3rd century. By the 2nd century, the 4 gospels are being copied together as a unit, and Christians are accepting them. So someone like Irenaeus, who's a Christian writer in the 2nd century, is very clear that Christians have 4 gospels and only 4 gospels. And both those things are important, not more and not less, right? And he goes on to explain that in the kinds of ways that he does. But what's important about that is he knew of lots of other gospels. And Origen, who's another early Christian writer from the 2nd and 3rd century, says the same thing. He also limits us to 4 and says exactly these 4. And Origen is well aware that there are other gospels out there, what we now call non-canonical gospels. Right?
Interesting.
So that core of the 4 gospels is from about as early as our evidence goes. We see evidence for those 4 gospels and only those 4 gospels. We have a few exceptions. There were apparently some Christians who accepted the gospel of Peter for a while, and then they were told to stop doing that. Okay. And no doubt there were other fringe groups that did accept other gospels. If they hadn't, they wouldn't have been copied and they wouldn't have been written, right? But our evidence is that those 4 gospels really had no real competitors in terms of canonical authoritative status.
And how'd they know that?
What's that?
How'd they know that? Like, what made them so sure?
Oh, okay, sorry, yes. Okay, so the basic criterion by which they judge books in or out, okay, does it have the authority of an apostle behind it? Okay, so in my opinion, apostolic authority is the crucial criterion that they use to judge a book. Was it written by an apostle, or they didn't think all the gospels, for example, were written by apostles? Was it written by a very close associate? So the early church is very clear that Mark's gospel, they do not think is written by Peter. They think it's written by Mark, but it's based on Peter's preaching. So in that sense, they could call the gospel Peter's, right? It's Peter's authority. It's his version, but Mark is the actual one who wrote it down. Okay. Put it into print, you might say. So I think for the early church, the key criterion was, can we attach it to the authority of an apostle? Either an apostle wrote it or a close associate. Okay. So a good test case for this is something like a writing called the Shepherd of Hermas, which is unfamiliar to most people today, but in the early church, it was real popular. Okay. And it's weird. I'm just going to be honest. I find it very odd. Okay. But they didn't. They kind of loved it. They really liked it, and they thought its theology was okay. I have some problems with its theology, but they apparently didn't all have problems with it. But they rejected it very clearly. And their reasoning was, they said, we know who wrote it, and he lived in the 2nd century, which means he couldn't have been an apostle or a close associate apostle. In other words, it's written too late. Now, it's not just because they thought, oh, it's too recent and new stuff is bad. You see, they weren't opposed to writing new stuff or reading new stuff, the latest hot seller or whatever. It's because it's too late to be written by an apostle.
Yeah.
And the authority is connected to the apostle. And without that, it cannot have the kind of authority in church that we need to have. So when Paul says, for example, that the church is built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, they picked up on that, and they said that means if something that we believe is connected to an apostle in this way, then it's in. If it's not, then it's out, even if we really like it, which they did with the Shepherd of Hermas. They really liked it, but they were convinced it was not written by an apostle. Now, I'll stop there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. How do we know that, like you said, Irenaeus, Origen, how do you know that that's the right Christianity? Why not these other fringe groups? Why isn't that the right Christianity?
It's a good question. Okay, well, 2 things. So one, we could say, look at the writings that we're most convinced are written by apostles, okay? And we can judge the other ones by them. So there are lots of other writings that claim to have an apostle as the author. So let's take the Gospel of Thomas, for example. Okay, and we have a Gospel of Peter. People didn't make up. They didn't forge these. They didn't write these other Gospels. Let's say you're not going to write if you want people to read your fake gospel, okay, in the ancient world, you're not going to say this is written by whoever, some no name. Do you know what I mean? Like, actually, it's one of the striking things about Mark's gospel. is that it's never Peter. Called the gospel according to Peter. It's consistently the gospel according to Mark, which is like, Mark is a nobody. If you got the choice between Mark and Peter, you're going to go with Peter, absolutely. So it's actually one of the reasons why I'm convinced that Mark's gospel is written by Mark, is because if the early church just didn't know who wrote it and is just making up names to attach to it, they would have picked Peter. So you get something like the Gospel of Thomas. Okay, great point of comparison. The Gospel of Thomas, I would maybe go so far as to say it has no gospel in it. So you might think this is another criterion they could use. Is it written by an apostle, and does it proclaim the actual gospel? Which say the way Paul lays out the gospel in 1 Corinthians 15, it's the death and resurrection of Jesus, his appearances, and that it's all backed up by Scripture. He says that twice in that little phrase in 1 Corinthians 15. According to the Scriptures, he repeats that twice, okay? Well, the Gospel of Thomas actually distances Jesus from the Old Testament Scriptures. There's one point in which the Gospel of Thomas seems to have Jesus saying, the Gospel of Thomas, by the way, is a collection of 114 sayings of Jesus,
okay.
supposed saying, okay? And in one of them, he seems to put distance between himself and the Old Testament prophets. Well, that is like very different from the 4 canonical Gospels, which are at pains to show. I mean, you think of like Matthew's introduction, and he's going out of his way to be like, this fulfills the Old Testament, even in places where you're like, how? Like he's like really insistent that Jesus is fulfilling the Old Testament. Whereas something like the Gospel of Thomas is actually trying to put distance between Jesus and okay. Another really important difference between the Gospel of Thomas is there's no death and resurrection.
Oh, wow.
So pretty much on all 3 points, the death, resurrection of Jesus, according to the Scriptures, the Gospel of Thomas fails all 3 of them. Right? So that's another mark, is you could say broadly, if you want to broaden that, to say something like theology. The early church knew right theology partly because it had been passed down by the apostles. And they were able to say, does this writing comport with what we know is what they would have called the rule of faith? That is the essential doctrines of the Christian faith. Does it fit with them or not? Okay. So it's not in competition with their other criterion of, is it written by an apostle or close associate? That those two actually dovetail together. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That's helpful. Thanks.
Cool. Well, yeah. So then just summarizing what we've talked about with manuscripts and the canon, how confident should we be with our translation?
With our translations. Okay.
Or just our Bible.
Our Bible in general. I mean, really confident, right? Like, so in terms of the books of the Bible, one of the remarkable things about on the New Testament side of things that actually makes it a bit easier is all the major branches of Christian faith have the same New Testament canon. That's pretty amazing when you think about it, given all of our other differences on theological matters and differences in practice and liturgy and all that. Like Roman Catholic, Protestant, Eastern Orthodox all have the same New Testament. And you could get in the Syriac Orthodox Church, which I think today now accepts the shorter Catholic letters. But like that's pretty amazing agreement across time and space, in my opinion. Okay. So that gives me great confidence. That's one thing that gives me confidence in our New Testament canon. In terms of the text, I have confidence because we have, again, as I said, the combination of early, good, and so many manuscripts. And then also I'm pretty confident because we've had several hundred years now to study them really carefully. Yeah. Like I'm really confident. Like when it was something like Jude 5, it's a choice between Jesus and the Lord. It's not a choice between Jude saying that God saved people from the Exodus or he didn't.
Right. It's not super significant either way.
Yeah. Like this is not a question of whether Jude thinks the Exodus happened, which would be a big deal, right? It's not like a choice between whether Jude thinks that Jesus is our Savior or not, right? Or whether he rose from the dead or not. Like no manuscript of the New Testament gives you a different foundational basic Christian theology. I even tell my students sometimes, like, in seminary, we get to the debates about Arminianism and Calvinism. Okay. We won't get into it here. Okay. Spare your listeners, but there's no Arminian manuscript out there. There's no Calvinist manuscript out there. There are manuscripts that some people read in one way or the other. Are you with me? But it's not like scribes, like they're so different that if you read this one, you'd definitely be a Calvinist. But if you read this one, you definitely wouldn't be. Do you know what I mean? They just, no. The differences in theology are matters of interpretation. Almost never are major doctrine. In fact, I can't think of a single doctrinal issue that hinges on a difference in manuscript. Now, that's not to say there aren't debated passages that involve variance. There are, okay, on certain issues. We could look at something like Junia in Romans 16 that involves some text criticism and touches on the issue of men and women in the church. But even that, it's like, that's not the deciding factor. Right. So basically, pick the King James Version, okay, or the ESV or the NASB, okay. Think of those as sort of the two ends of this textual spectrum, okay. You have the most differences between English Bibles in terms of text between something like the King James and the NASB. You're not going to come up with a different Christian faith because you read one rather than the other.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? So,
Yeah.
now, again, it's not to trivialize all the differences between them, but they do not rise to the level of our, let's call them our essential Christian beliefs.
Unless you're a snake handler.
Unless you're, no, see, this is a perfect example because, as I always tell people, like people are always like, oh, that's why they took the long ending of Mark out because of snake handling, and I'm like, who did that? People in the Middle Ages who didn't handle snakes? They did not care. Nobody was handling snakes until America was founded, and there was one tiny strip of the American landscape that somehow, and I don't even know when it started, but I think probably like 19th century, decided, hey, what if we read this part of the Bible and actually tried to handle snakes? Like, nobody's ever done that before, right? So in my mind, that's a perfect example where the issue is not at all textual, it's entirely bad application. Right? And you can't look at textual criticism to solve all your bad interpretations. I'm afraid to tell you. I wish it could, but it can't. Some people are just really bad readers of the Bible, and I can't help you with that, at least in terms of manuscripts, right? Manuscripts aren't going to help you there, one way or the other.
If anyone's
You
confused,
just need to learn to
about
read the Bible
Paul
better.
handling snakes in the end of Acts.
Well,
That's right. He
Yeah.
does, yeah.
Uh,
But he doesn't tell people to go out and do it, right?
Yeah.
He gets bitten by a snake. He's not like, let's have a special church service where we pull our rattlesnakes out of our aquarium and see if they bite us. Like, that doesn't prove anything except that you're stupid and bad at reading the Bible. Sorry. If there's any snake handlers listening, I
Yeah.
apologize for my
we'll tell them.
bluntness.
We'll send your email out and
Yeah, send
talk
them
to you
my
about
email
that.
all right, let's talk about tools available. So
Okay.
if people wanted to dig in more to this topic, where should they go?
Okay. If they want to know what important differences are there in our manuscripts that would affect translation and interpretation, I recommend the Net Bible. NET stands for New English Translation. You can go to netbible.org. And the Net Bible is famous because it's the first major translation done via the internet, where they solicited feedback from the internet. So they got thousands and thousands and thousands of readers' comments. The other thing that makes it distinctive is that it's the translation that does by far the most to explain itself.
Mhm.
That is to explain why they have translated the way they have. So you end up in the footnotes, you get a kind of running commentary, actually. And one type of commentary note they have there is textual notes, okay? And those will discuss textual variants, both in the Old and New Testament. And I would recommend that listeners who, obviously don't know Greek, they could use that translation and see where those variants are, okay? And get a short discussion, usually in the footnote, about why the translators preferred one over the other, okay? The other place they can go is just to their own Bible's footnotes. If they don't read the Net Bible, but any major translation today, even the New King James, will have footnotes when there are important differences in the manuscripts. Okay. They won't always tell you why they picked one. They won't tell you why they picked one or the other, but at least you'll know what they are. Okay. So that's probably like the bottom shelf where people can go. Okay. To start learning about that.
Yeah. And
Then if they want to know,
listeners, we interviewed Hampton Keithley, who helped found the Net translation. So
yeah,
they can listen to that.
Yeah, more info, go to that episode.
Yep.
Yeah, great. So yeah, that's probably the first place they go. Then beyond that, then you do something like pick up a book on the subject and kind of dive in. And fair warning, you might get hooked. Textual criticism has been known to catch a few people and they never escape its clutches. So you may find yourself one of these people that gets hooked on the subject.
Yeah, can you talk about what's out there for scholars? What are scholars looking at right now?
This is the main thing that scholars are using now. It is the big fat edition of the Greek New Testament. This is just Mark's Gospel.
What?
Okay. Yes, this is just Mark's Gospel.
What's in there?
It's called the Editio Critica Maior. That's Latin for just major critical edition of the New Testament. By critical, they mean it incorporates differences in the manuscript. So on a typical page, you get a few lines of Greek text at the top and then lots of variants down below. Okay. That's extremely useful for somebody like me who does this for a living and studies scribal mistakes.
Mhm.
What kind of mistakes do scribes tend to make? Which ones are the most common? And what helps explains why they were easy mistakes to make. The more I know about the mistakes scribes were prone to make, the better able I am to identify those mistakes in other places. Does that make sense? So it's a simple process. You start with the easy mistakes to identify. You start to learn from those ones, and then you work your way up to the harder ones like Jude 5, right? And the more experience you have as a scholar working through lots and lots of examples of scribal mistakes, then when you get to the really hard cases like Jude 5, you're much better equipped to make a good decision. Does that make sense? So that's the main thing that scholars are using, called the Didaiocritical Meyer. They have that for Acts, Mark, and what are called the Catholic letters, which it just means universal letters, James through Jude. They are, what are they working on now? They're working on Matthew, I think, and Luke. Actually, they're working on the whole New Testament, basically. But they have different teams in different places in the world that are working on them, so they're all kind of in different places of the process. So, but yeah, I expect in my lifetime probably we'll get the full set.
Wow. Have you helped on any of those, or do you just receive them?
No, I actually am sort of an outside critic. My job is sort of to be outside the process and keep them accountable the best I can. But they're really good. I mean, these are watershed editions. They're meant to replace an edition from back in the 19th century, and they will be much better than that edition. Even I think they will set the foundation for the next 100+ years of scholarship in my field. So yeah, it's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, and then just briefly touch on the CBGM.
Okay, yeah. So behind these new editions, they are using computers to help them make decisions. So that's probably the biggest way that my field of study has changed in the last, I don't know, depends how far back you want to go, but at least the last 20 years or so. Because we have so many manuscripts, it's hard to keep track of them all as a human being. So this edition includes over 100 manuscripts. And even that's just a lot for the human mind to keep track of. So, but if I'm a scholar, I'm going through these places of variation and trying to sort out the original text at each point. 100 places in, I don't remember what I thought the first 20 places. But if I've recorded it with the computer and told the computer what I thought, the computer has no trouble keeping a record. And so as I go through as an editor, make my decisions, the computer can keep track of all my decisions, and then use those to feed that information back to me and say, based on your own judgments, here's the relationship you think exists between, the most likely relationship between the manuscripts and their text. Okay. And so that then knowing the relationships is really helpful to know which manuscripts are the most important. Okay. So it's like, if you think in these terms, if it's like a family tree, if you're trying to trace your family's ancestry, okay, it really matters that you can distinguish between one of your mom's sisters and your mom's grandmas. Like telling the difference between those is kind of a big deal, right? Yeah. And if you can identify her grandma as not being her aunt or whatever, you're further back in the ancestry. In the same way, if we can relate manuscripts to each other, we can try to discern which ones go further back in the ancestry. And those ones are not always, okay? But all things being equal, those ones tend to be better. Okay, so it helps us evaluate manuscripts better. So that's the short version.
Awesome.
Yeah.
If you want more, though, you can read my dissertation, which will only cost you about $100.
Yeah.
But Christmas is coming, friends.
Didn't you write a shorter introduction?
I did. Yes, it's true. I should mention that. I did write a shorter version of it. It's too far back. I'll pull my headphones out if I reach for it. But yes, it's called A New Approach to Textual Criticism. I wrote it with my friend Tommy Wasserman, who's also a textual critic.
Okay. Awesome.
It's cheaper, I should say, and shorter. It's fewer footnotes.
So to close up here, tell us, how is all this technical study, looking at all the details of manuscripts, how has that made you enjoy the Bible more?
Yeah, I think the probably the main way is that doing this kind of work forces me to pay attention to the details of the text in a way that few other things ever have. So learning Greek was one thing that forced me to pay attention to the Bible more, read it more closely, because it's a different language, and all of a sudden I was tripping over the vocabulary and all that stuff, as you do with a different language. So that alone just forced you to slow down, read more carefully. But now when I'm thinking about not just the different language, but the different manuscripts of the Greek language. So one says this, one says that with something like Jude 5. It's forcing me to read it more carefully and think to myself, well, what would the difference be if Jude said that Jesus led a people out of the land of Egypt? How would that affect what he's saying, right? It wouldn't change the fact that people have come out of Egypt. But it does have some effect on what he's saying. And I want to know, as a Christian, I love the Bible all the way down to its finest details, right? And I try not to confuse those details, try not to lose the forest for the trees, as they say, right? But I really do love the trees because they make me read the Bible even more closely. And I think there's a lot to appreciate in the Bible, all the way from the highest level of just a basic child's understanding of it, of its message, all the way down to, looking at one word in one verse and trying to say, what exactly did Jude say and why? Because here's the thing, when you're looking at differences, the hardest ones to decide are the ones where all the different readings make sense, right? Jude could have said that God led a people out of Egypt, couldn't he? And that would be theologically true. He could have said the Lord led a people out of Egypt, or he could have said Jesus. Well, some people think he couldn't have, but I do. But that's part of the debate. But anyways, the point is to say, those are all theologically true, but he only said one of them. Mm-hmm. But precisely by having the other ones, it forces me to think more carefully about what I think he did say. And say, he could have said it this way, but he didn't. And actually, when you start to think that way about the Bible, you find yourself reading it a lot more closely and paying a lot closer attention to it. And, look, I'll be honest, there are times where even as a scholar, I look at it and go, I have no idea. He could have said it this way, and I don't know why he didn't. I just am pretty confident he didn't, and so that's fine. I just move on with my life. But other times, forcing myself to think through that question, why didn't he say it this way, leads to really profound insight. And so I'd say that's the biggest thing, is that it's forced me to pay attention to the Bible at a very, very close level. And that has led me to just appreciate it all that much more, because it's the Word of God, right? As our Lord said, quoting the Old Testament, man does not live by bread alone, right? But by every word that comes from the mouth of God. So I try to take all the words as serious as I can.
Yeah. Awesome.
All right. Well, thank you, Peter, for your time. And
yeah, this is awesome. Great clarification and encouragement to trust our Bibles.
Yeah,
thanks for all your work that you do as well.
Yeah. And then I always like to say, it doesn't matter what translation you have. What matters is which one do you read. Because if you don't read the translation you have, it doesn't matter if it's a good one or a bad one. So read your Bible. That's my departing message for you.
Awesome. All right. Thanks again.
Thank you, guys.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of The Bible Toolbox. All of the resources mentioned in this episode are posted on our website, thebibletoolbox.com. There you can also find out more information on how to give and support us. And we have loved all of the encouragement and feedback we've received from you. So thanks so much.